Good morning, history students. Today we're going to be doing notes 1.3, the Civil War and Reconstruction. Your essential question: what impact did the Civil War have on U.S. history? Remember, you're going to need a title and your essential question for each set of your notes. I'm going to go ahead and put this on present with the closed captions. Okay, so again, don't forget to put the title and your essential question at the beginning of each set of notes. Today we're briefly going to go over the Civil War and Reconstruction. So, just a quick recap from our notes 1.2. There were several reasons that the Civil War was started and was fought, but the main reason that we fought the Civil War was slavery. You will hear different things in different places across the United States on why the war was fought, but it was fought because of slavery. Okay. Some argue that the federal government and the state government had different ideas of power and the power of the larger government versus the smaller state governments. This war did last from 1861 until 1865. At the time, it was the bloodiest war in American history with over 600,000 total casualties. So I'm going to briefly review some of the causes of the war that we talked about last time. So the Missouri Compromise, remember when we were gaining all of this new territory, moving westward, manifest destiny. We had some conflict because we had an even number between states in the South that had slavery and states in the North that did not have slavery. So we had to maintain that balance between slave states and free states. When Missouri was admitted as a state with slavery, we also had to admit another state in the North. That's when we admitted Maine as a free state. We also had a book come out during that time. Remember, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it showed the realities of life of enslaved people and the horrible conditions of slavery. Most people, unless you were living in the South and had experienced slavery or seen slavery, you didn't really know the horrors of what was happening. Remember, they didn't have nightly news like we have tonight, they didn't have cell phones, they had no way of spreading the information. So, when the Kansas Territory was being introduced into the nation, there was violence between the two opposing sides, the sides that wanted slavery to be able to exist in Kansas and those that didn't. So, there was conflict. People were getting violent with one another when they were having their discussions and debates about being pro slavery or being against slavery within that territory. John Brown, remember we talked about last time, so I'm just going to briefly go over him. John Brown was an abolitionist. He was a white man who was against slavery, so he decided to gather people together, and he believed that the only way to fight slavery was to pick up arms and fight back against it physically. So eventually he would be hung for what they considered his crimes, taking violent action against slavery, against Southerners who wanted slavery. And Dred Scott, his case went up to the Supreme Court. So Dred Scott was an enslaved man, and he said that since he was born in the United States, that made him a citizen, and therefore slavery was against his constitutionally protected rights. Now, the Supreme Court denied it. They said that a slave was property, an enslaved person was property, and they were not, therefore, a citizen, so they could not sue in court. It was one of the worst decisions in the US Supreme Court history. And then lastly, the last thing that we talked about in our review was the election of Abraham Lincoln. So, although Abraham Lincoln was personally opposed to slavery, publicly as an elected official, he was for whatever was going to make our country whole. So, keep the nation united in one way or another. So, there's a lot of misinformation about Lincoln being against slavery. He was personally, but not politically. But when he was elected in 1860, a lot of the Southerners didn't believe that he was going to let the states figure it out. He believed that they were going to have to get rid of slavery because Abraham Lincoln was personally against it. So when he was elected in 1860, quickly after the election, states in the South started to secede from the Union, which means they decided they no longer wanted to be a part of the United States. They were leaving the United States and they were going to form their own country. So you can see all of these states did leave the Union and the dates that they did that. And now we have war. So the first actual conflict of the Civil War was the Battle of Fort Sumter, April 1861. So, over the course of these notes, we're going to go over some of the battles. I am not going to quiz you specifically on battles of any historical context that we go through. It's not important to me that you know the specific battle and what happened in that battle. It's just giving you context for the greater overall understanding of the Civil War and what happened. Okay, so just so everyone knows, 4 notes. You don't have to memorize dates and battles, soldiers, things like that. Okay. So, the Battle of Fort Sumter, Confederate forces opened fire upon the fort. They believed that that fort belonged to them, not part of the North, not part of the Union. And that was the beginning of the fighting between what we call the Union and the Confederate forces. So, the Union is the United States. That's our country. In the North, the states. And the South is the country that was newly formed, the states that seceded from the Union. They decided to have their own country called the Confederate States of America. So, we call them the Confederate Army. Their new country, the Confederate States of America, elected their own president. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederate States of America. He was inaugurated for a 6-year term on 1862. Confederate States of America would not last until 1862. They would only last until the war was over. So they lasted for about 4 years. This flag that's behind Jefferson Davis is the flag of the Confederate Army. It's been getting a lot of press lately because a lot of people are saying that that flag is no longer acceptable to fly. It is no longer acceptable to have on a military base. The military has outlawed this flag because it's a treasonous flag. This flag was a country that fought a war against the United States. And so we don't consider that to be a flag of the United States. NASCAR has outlawed that flag at their events. It is seen as a symbol of slavery, of oppression, and of hate, which is why so many places are outlawing it now. We continued the battling through 1861. There is Abraham Lincoln. Presidents used to actually go and visit the battlefields, the war sites, meet with the generals. So that's what he was doing back in 1861. His goal and the goal of the Union Army was to hit the South quickly and to end the war as soon as possible. Their original goal was to have the war over in 90 days. That's 3 months. They weren't able to do that because that did last for 4 years, but that was their original goal. And the Confederate side had their general leading their army. His name was Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall was actually a nickname that he earned for being so strong in battle. So General Jackson was the leader of the Confederate Army. 1862, we begin to have naval warfare. So that means we are on ships on the sea. The North decides what they're going to do is they're going to get in ships and they're going to go around the South and they're going to attack this way. So it was called the Anaconda Plan because it looked like a big snake. Their route looked like a big snake. The North started to lose some morale in the war in 1862 because they were not able to defeat these people as quickly as they thought they were. The battle continued to rage and the war continued to rage on in 1862. 1862, Abraham Lincoln, after they won a battle, was able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this was a speech that he gave. I'm sorry, let me go back. This was a speech that he gave where he said all of the enslaved people in the South will be free, but that didn't actually end slavery because remember, those states did not consider themselves to be part of the United States. Their president was Jefferson Davis, not Abraham Lincoln. So, Abraham Lincoln saying that did not actually free anybody, although people like to claim that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. It did not, in fact. That will be the 13th Amendment, which is coming up later. So women also participated. I want you to know that. Women participated in the war. African Americans participated in the war. It wasn't just white men, as we see in most of the pictures about the war. So Dorothea Dix was one of the most famous nurses at the time. She fought for females to be able to be nurses. Women at the time, they didn't want women to be nurses working on the battlefields, on the sidelines, because they said that doctors didn't want to work with women. They said it wasn't women's work. Remember, they were doing very, very brutal things at the time. They were dealing with soldiers who had gangrene, who had lost limbs, who had been stabbed with bayonets. Their intestines were coming out. They had to deal with all of those things, and they were trying to save lives. So it was a very bloody, violent work. And they said it was not women's work. So Dorothea Dix had to fight for women to be able to do this work. Clara Barton actually brought the Red Cross to the United States during this time. She is known as the Angel of the Battlefield. And women were fighting in the war as well. You all might have heard of Mulan before. Mulan has a movie coming out pretty soon. It was also a Disney movie back in the 90s. So Mulan was someone who fought long, long time ago. She dressed as a man to be able to fight in the war, and women did that here in our war, our Civil War as well. So women concealed their identities so they could battle alongside their Union and Confederate counterparts. So they fought on both sides of the war. So women would bound their breasts and they would layer clothing. They would put dirt on their faces. They cut their hair really short. They tried to look as masculine as they possibly could so they could pass as men to be able to fight in the war. They also did this during the Revolutionary War. Women also worked as spies during the war. And one of the most famous women that I don't have on this slide, but I probably should, is Harriet Tubman. She also fought in the war. So she actually led armies during the war after her time in the Underground Railroad. So, again, that Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free any enslaved people. So it is known for that, but it didn't actually do that. So he did argue that freedom would come to the enslaved people if the Union won the war. So the Battle of Gettysburg is probably the most famous battle of this war. It took place from July 1st to 3rd of 1863. There's a big cemetery now at that battlefield, at the site of the former battlefield. In this 2-day, 3-day battle, we lost 51,000 soldiers, either killed, wounded, or captured in this 3-day battle. But this gave the president the ability to write then the Gettysburg Address. So after this battle, he wrote this speech and he gave it on the battleground where they had previously fought. So Abraham Lincoln delivered this speech. It's a very short speech. You may have heard of it before. It starts 407 years ago. It's actually behind him on the Lincoln Memorial if you ever go to Washington, D.C., and you can check that out. And that is the entirety of the speech right there. Okay, not very long at all. That was the whole speech. So Abraham Lincoln would be reelected in 1864. So as the war is winding down, and when he is reelected, they decide to start a new strategy. We call it Sherman's March to the Sea. The North, the Union Army, is going to destroy all targets. We call that total war. That's what we'll call it in future wars. So the Union destroyed military targets as they were before, but they also destroyed any infrastructure, any industry. So they blew up factories, they blew up train stations, rail yards, so to prevent the transportation of any goods down to the Confederacy. They also destroyed any civilian property. So they went through and they burned houses down, they destroyed homes, they destroyed farms, things like that. So they did this to try to end the war because it had been going on for 4 years now. And it did work. Robert E. Lee ended up surrendering. So the Confederate Army General Robert E. Lee surrendered to the Union Army General Ulysses S. Grant, which he will go on to become a US president after the war is over. And the former quote unquote president of the South of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, was arrested. In 1865, right at the beginning of the year, Congress passed and ratified the 13th Amendment. This is what actually abolished slavery in the United States, the 13th Amendment. And this is the actual text of the amendment. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So that means that slavery is no longer allowed in the United States except as punishment for a crime. And we will come back to that later because slavery didn't actually officially end if we kept it as a punishment for a crime. All right, and then President Lincoln was assassinated. You probably all remember learning about this in elementary school or maybe middle school. 1865, April 14th, John Wilkes Booth actually jumps into President Lincoln's theater box there at the theater watching a play, and he shoots him in the back of the head. Abraham Lincoln was brought to his home, and he actually ended up dying at 7 a.m. the next morning. Eventually, his killer he fled, but eventually he was captured and arrested. And the Civil War was over. So over 3 million soldiers participated in the war. Over 600,000 soldiers died in the war. It was our deadliest conflict at that point in US history from 1861 to 1865. Reconstruction is the period that happened after the war. So we want to decide what to do with the South. Now, all of these states that just left the Union, that fought a war against the United States, what do we do with them now? How do we bring them back into the United States and have us be whole as a country again? So, President Lincoln, when they were planning this before his assassination, he planned to pardon everyone in the South except for the highest ranking military officers. So, the President Jefferson Davis, anyone, General E. Lee, the people who were at the top, those people were going to be convicted, but he was planning on pardoning everyone else in the lower ranks of the military and all of the citizens as well. Many people in the North who were abolitionists, who were against slavery, risked their lives to go down to help all of these people that were now considered the freedmen. So, all of these people that were formerly enslaved were now free. But what were all of these people going to do? Remember, it was illegal for them to learn how to read and write. They didn't have any property, they didn't have any land. So, they needed someone to help them get established now as freedmen. So we had the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865 of people who went down there and helped out. People in the South did not like that. They called them carpetbaggers. They tried to insult them. They said they were just trying to make a profit off of Reconstruction. After Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, we did have a new president, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a Jacksonian Democrat. He was a white supremacist. He yeah, he definitely believed that white people were somehow superior to the newly freed African Americans. And in the South, although they are now part of the United States again, we have a revival of their defiance against the North and the United States. And they start creating something that they would call the Black Codes. So while slavery was officially over, the treatment of African Americans in the South did not really improve very much. So the Black Codes were trying to get a stable labor supply for people in the South. So a lot of people in the South ended up becoming sharecroppers because they had worked in agriculture before that. They then continued in that work because that was the only thing that they knew. They were called tenant farmers, so they had to get some land from previous slave owners, and they had to work that land and make very small profits. And then they had to pay back their land and they had to pay back for the tools and all of those things that they needed to use. Congress had created something called the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, and that was to create things like schools for the children and support for all of these newly freed people. And President Johnson actually vetoed that. So he said no, he did not agree with that and didn't pass it. But Congress went ahead and overrode his veto. So Congress has the ability to check by overriding a veto. So it takes 2/3 of Congress to override a presidential veto, but they were able to do that. That was the first time that Congress did that in US history. The next amendment they would pass would be the 14th Amendment in 1968. This amendment guaranteed rights and security of all free people. So it said anyone born in the United States is a United States citizen and is protected by the Constitution, period. So it went ahead and fixed that Dred Scott problem that we had before the war. So now anyone born in the United States is guaranteed all the rights and securities under the Constitution. This has been used for different civil rights over the years. Marriage equality, they use the 14th Amendment and the equal protection of all people to be able to get marriage equality in the United States. So we did have some Reconstruction Acts passed in the South. The South was now divided into 10 unreconstructed states and 5 military districts. So the military went down and was helping them rebuild, but also was in control. They were not considered free states quite yet. They had to be rebuilt by the North. Congress also passed the Tenure of Office Act, which says the president could not remove any officials without the Senate's consent. So if the president wanted to fire someone, the president would have to ask the Senate before they fired someone. President Johnson decided he didn't need to do that, so President Johnson go ahead and he removed this person Stanton in 1868 without the approval of Congress. And so Congress decided that they were going to impeach him for this new crime that he committed. So the House impeached him on February 24th before even actually drawing up the official charges, but they went ahead and impeached him. Now, what we're going to learn about impeachment is it's actually a two-step process. So it requires both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So if you're thinking like if someone got arrested, you get arrested by the House of Representatives and then you go to trial in the Senate. So now he isn't actually getting arrested, but that's kind of how a trial works, right? So the House impeached him, and then it had to go to the Senate, and the Senate had to try him and decide if they were going to remove him from office or not. So they ended up acquitting him. It was just one vote short of actually removing him from office, but it does take a two-thirds vote to remove him from office. He would become our first president to be impeached. He would not be the last, but he would be impeached. We would have President Clinton be impeached in the 90s and President Trump be impeached last year. But none of these people were actually removed from office because they were impeached by the House of Representatives and then they were acquitted in the Senate. So they were not found guilty and removed from office by the Senate. President Ulysses S. Grant would become our next president after in 1868. I'm sorry, 1868. So after he was the general for the Union Army, he would go on to be the president. And this is the breakdown of the presidential election. Many people in the South that were formerly enslaved were now sharecropping, so they were working on those same areas that they had previously been enslaved. We began to see a rise in Black political participation. Now, this is still men, women were still not able to vote, and the majority of these people were former soldiers. We also began to see an establishment of what we call HBCs or HBCUs. These are historically Black colleges. So remember, back in that time, they did not want to send formerly enslaved people to school. They definitely didn't want them going to their colleges, so they created their own colleges and their own schools so that they could educate themselves as well. There was African Americans back then, just so you know, in the House and in the Senate. They did face racism in person and in the press, which is what you can see here. Majority of those voters were Black veterans, so they fought in the war, in the Civil War. And in 1870, we had the 15th Amendment be passed. So in 1870, the 15th Amendment said the right to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Women's rights groups were actually very angry at the time in 1870 that they were not also given the right to vote. We had very famous people who were working together, women, white women, and African American men. Also, African American women were fighting for the right to vote, so they were disappointed that they didn't get that right either. But like Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, those were two of the people fighting for the right to vote. They were friends, and this was a division between the two of them because they were both fighting for the right to vote. And the 15th Amendment only gave African American men the right to vote. Women would have to wait 50 more years before they got the right to vote. There was a rise in the KKK in the South during this time that was called the Invisible Empire of the South. There were thousands of lynchings that happened in this nation. They were a terrorist organization, the KKK, and they murdered people without fair trial for any minor infraction that they deemed was worthy of killing people. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1865 that was passed, and it was going to make it a crime for any individual to deny full and equal use of any public place. But it actually lacked any strong enforcement, so people in the South did not really enforce this. People in the North as well, there was also across the United States, there was segregation based on race, and there was no new Civil Rights Act that was attempted in the United States for the next 90 years. So things started going pretty south in the Reconstruction process. We had the Panic of 1873. So there was a depression in the economy. People weren't doing very well. People were continuing westward, manifest destiny. There was a lot of conflict with Native Americans while they were trying to steal their land. We would have 1876. President Hayes would become the next president, and he decides to leave the South alone. He's going to leave the situation and have a formal end to Reconstruction in this nation. That did not solve the problems of the South, but they left Reconstruction, and that's where Reconstruction ends. So don't forget to write a summary at the end of your notes. Thank you.